But first of all, let me tell people that this now is a vegan time tunnel, and we're building up an archive of significant events in the movement, of which Wendy is one. So
it's the nicest thing you've said to me, Doc.
Probably is, yeah. And, so I switched in recent weeks to doing time tunnel interviews, of which this is one. And so we've got a particular kind of remit to try to discuss Wendy and I. So first of all, just welcome everybody to the show. There's no holding us back today, Wendy. All these things flashing up and that. So
whistles and bells, amazing.
how are you generally? Are you good?
Yeah, I've been better, but I'm okay. Yeah. We might talk about a little bit later as well. But
yes, okay. Right. So well, I mean, I suppose we could start by doing the how and why the vegan bit for you. I suppose we could do that at the start.
How and why the vegan bit? So yeah, and I think we've had this chat before, and I know we've had this chat with other activists as well, that I was an activist before I became a vegan. So I was vegetarian as a kid. I just had an affinity and a love for animals, for other animals, and just decided I didn't want to consume them anymore when I was younger. And thankfully my mum was really supportive of that, and so I became vegetarian really young. But then I got involved in movement as a teenager, and then sort of as I got into the movement and got to learn more about the other industries other than just so-called meat industry, then it just was the natural evolution to start living vegan. So it was just kind of organic, really. And I feel like it would have happened. I just needed those little catalysts along the way to kind of bring veganism into my awareness and that kind of thing. So
but in terms of campaigning, and this brings us to our topic, because what we're trying to do in terms of this time tunnel is to look at when did the movement stop its focus on anti-vivisection and begin its overwhelming focus on vegan education, right? Because I think this is a really kind of interesting thing, and obviously it's part of the history of the movement, because it was in 88 when you started with
Uncaged. Yeah, it probably was around that time, late 1980s and then into the early 90s, and it was definitely very anti-vivisection focused, the things that I was doing, but also the other activism that I was aware of. I definitely wasn't aware of any vegan outreach or vegan education. That's not to say it wasn't going on somewhere, but I wasn't aware of it at all. I was only aware of like this single issue campaigns.
Can you say who Uncaged is or was? Is it still going?
No, they're not still going. So Uncaged Campaigns, I think they actually officially started in the early 90s. So I've got a feeling that I was aware of them before they officially started, or there were other things going on before they were an official organization. So that was the early 90s, and they were very much focused on obviously anti-vivisection and focusing on so-called animal research. And Dan Lyons was, he didn't co-found it. I think that was Angela Roberts, and the other name escapes me, but Dan Lyons was the CEO for a while, and he was doing a doctorate all around kind of other animals in politics and things like that. And he was very instrumental in a lot of the kind of campaigns and what was going on. We were campaigning a lot against xenotransplantation, which was pig to primate organ transplants, and against Immutran, which was a company who were kind of doing all of this so-called research. And it was all very much around this and pushing politically, trying to get things changed on a political sphere as well, in terms of what was going on in animal research. So that was very much Uncaged and their focus. And I think they kind of disbanded, or whatever the word might be, in about 2011, 2012, and then Dan Lyons formed the Centre for Animals in Social Justice. But I did kind of have a bit of contact with him a few years ago when I was trying to get him onto the podcast, and he was going to be a guest of mine. But then it kind of fizzled out, and I couldn't get hold of him. And I'm not sure what he's still doing, whether he's still doing anything with CASJ. But Uncaged Campaigns, as far as I'm aware, isn't still going.
No, certainly not heard much of them. And they were based in Sheffield, weren't they? Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, because I remember Dan Lyons suddenly became Dr. Dan Lyons during the...
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. So what was that lab that you mentioned then?
Which lab?
The laboratory you just mentioned.
Laboratory was Immutran. So I don't know if that was a laboratory. It was more the company or the organisation who were kind of funding, I suppose, or sponsoring all this research, or where the research was being done. I don't know if it was actually a laboratory. I'd have to check that out, actually. Huntingdon Life Sciences was definitely involved, so I think that was the laboratory that was been targeted as well, which of course is prominent throughout other campaigns, like obviously you just had Jake on with Sha, and there were a lot of campaigns against Huntingdon.
So
they were involved in the...
Would that have been a pressure campaign, Wendy?
Well, we used to do a lot of, I guess it would have been considered that in a way. We were doing a lot of protests, marches. We were trying to get into the media. There were a lot of, there's a lot of letter writing, emailing, contacting MPs, marches to the Home Office, die-ins, as we called them, outside the Home Office, where we would dress in costumes. I don't know how I feel about all of this now, but dress in costumes, and usually primate costumes, and then lie outside the doors of the Home Office and lie on the road, lie in the streets, things like this. And then we'd protest outside Westminster. There were just lots of things like that. And then we'd hold stalls as well. So we'd hold stalls to collect money, to get petitions signed, to give out literature, to raise awareness. So it was multi-pronged, lots of different forms of activism under the same campaign. So I guess in a way, it might be considered a pressure campaign. And of course, alongside, at the time, there was very much a climate of direct action against laboratories, against places like in the UK, places like Boots, people who were, very much involved with so-called animal research and things like that. So,
yeah. Where do you stand on the language of the anti-vivisection thing? Because Joan Janaea always suggested that we should always use the word vivisection, whereas a lot of others are saying most people don't know what it means.
Yeah, I know, and I've always used that word, and I suppose because I came into the movement with, through that side of activism as well, I've always used that term, and it does seem to be a very visceral word that kind of emotes something, the nastiness that it is. Whereas I think when we talk about research, it can sound quite fluffy, and I know Jeremy's just left. It would have been good to get his take on this, but I know we often, Jeremy and I, talk about putting research and testing in quotation marks, because I don't know whether it really does the horrors of what goes on justice in a way. So at least anti-vivisection or vivisection, although in real terms it means dissection of live animals, which obviously that's not always accurate in a lot of the so-called research that is going on. It still, I think, is very emotive and very visceral, and then I think maybe it's up to us to educate people as to what that is, maybe, rather than kind of abandoning the word. So yeah, at the moment I do still use it, and I also use research, but in quotation marks, and I will use experiments, but I might say so-called experiments. So I'm kind of playing around with the language on that. It's a work in progress.
Aren't we all? So,
Yes.
so would you say, and I think you've said this before actually, that you were a campaigner first and then a vegan advocate? So is that the right way to put it? How would you put that?
Do you mean it in terms of timeline, or in terms of how I identify myself?
Yeah, time. I mean, really, because
Timeline.
our remit is to kind of like try to trace the kind of decline in vivisection campaigning and the upsurge in vegan education. When did it happen? Because we can talk about the time in a while, but in terms of your own kind of story, you presumably started being an anti-vivisectionist when you were a vegetarian, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So yeah, I was campaigning for a few years before I became aware of veganism. And then even when I became aware of veganism, it was a little bit on the fringes, and I just kind of had a slight awareness of it. And, I hear people are doing this, kind of not wearing so-called leather and things like that. But again, it took a little while for me to evolve into that, because it wasn't as prevalent as it is now. And I didn't have many people in my circle. So I think it can really depend on your environment, who you're around, what people are talking about, what are your influences and that kind of thing. So I was definitely an activist, a campaigner, way before I even knew what veganism was.
Yeah, Debbie's making that point that most people these days don't know what it means. Yeah, it's a real kind of interesting conundrum. So you're a vegetarian anti-vivisectionist. So can you remember the vegan part, that when that started and why?
For me, or as I noticed it in the movement, do you mean?
No, for you first.
For me. So it was because when I was involved with Uncaged, I was also doing other campaigns with Viva. You mentioned Viva earlier, which used to be Vegetarians' International Voice for Animals at the time. So I was very much aware of them and their campaigns. So I would do some of campaigns with them. And they were, even though they were not advocating for veganism as such, they were running articles, and there were kind of sort of flyers and things around that started to talk about the dairy industry, egg industries, all that kind of thing. And I just started to become more and more aware of these kind of things. And then for me, it was also, I had a friend who'd become vegan. And then once I had these vegans in my awareness, it was like, oh, wow, people I know are actually vegan now. This is great. So, and I just decided one day, I thought, well, it just seems illogical. I think I'd actually resisted it a little bit, actually, because of that fear. And I can empathize with what people say now when they're vegetarian, is like, oh, it just seems really extreme. And that was the way it tended to be talked about then, is like veganism was an extreme form of vegetarianism, which of course we wouldn't really think of it in those terms now, because veganism is a philosophy. But I think at the time it was, if you're a vegan, you're just an extreme vegetarian, and it's really difficult. And to be fair, at the time, I think living vegan then, in terms of what was available to you in terms of your food resources and things like that, was probably a lot harder then in the UK than it is now to be a vegan. Vegetarianism was hard even back then. It just wasn't, where in my circles, it wasn't that prevalent and wasn't that easy. And I think veganism was obviously seen as like way harder. But then I just committed to it and just thought, this is illogical. I'm campaigning, I'm doing all these campaigns, I'm aware of what's going on and these violations, and it doesn't make any sense. And it just, something clicked, and that was it. It was like, that was the decision. And it was the best decision, of course, ever to be made. And then it all fitted together. Then I felt more aligned. Then it felt like, yeah, this is I'm embodying my practice. I'm embodying what I believe and what I've always actually naturally felt, but didn't really understand or have the language for.
Okay, let's try and kind of reverse engineer this the other way. Was you aware, do you think, when you were with Uncaged, of a lot of flesh eaters as part of the campaign? I
can't remember whether they were or they weren't, because to be fair, we weren't really talking about veganism.
No.
So it wouldn't, I just assumed, I guess, that a lot of people would have been like me and would have been maybe vegetarian. I mean, there probably would have been vegans, but it wasn't like, because that wasn't as normalized as it is today, veganism, it wasn't as spoken about. So it wasn't the first thing you would assume about someone or ask them. You were just there for the purpose of doing that campaign.
Yeah, nobody would have asked in those days, would they? Which is, see, I mean, this conversation we're having, to people who are really relatively new to the movement, they're going to be going,
yeah,
aren't they? You know, so it's quite interesting that the movement existed as it did, and veganism was kind of there or thereabouts, but not really. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yeah, I think it just wasn't as it is now. And it's like you've been saying throughout the day on the bits that I've caught, you have to kind of view things through that lens of its time. So I think our mindset at the time was very different to people coming into the movement now, because people are coming into the movement aware of veganism and with a whole host of vegan-friendly options in restaurants or vegan-only restaurants and things like that. And that just wasn't a thing. That just wasn't in the public awareness, let alone, you know, most people's awareness. I remember when I first decided to live vegan and I'd mention that I was living vegan, people would get me to repeat what I'd said because they didn't even know the word. And they would just, I'm sure they were thinking I'd said Vulcan or something, like I was off Star Trek. You know, it was just like, it was so alien that people didn't.
Sure that wasn't just a Yorkshire accent. So
it might have been.
Related question is this one from Deb. Any of your family vegans? Or were any?
No, they weren't, and they still aren't. Although there are a few vegetarians in the family now, and back then, I don't think my family would have even heard the word vegetarian. When I became vegetarian, I didn't even know the word vegetarian. It was just a choice to stop consuming other animals because I had this strong feeling in me that I just did not want to consume them. And I had a real love and respect for them that I can't even explain. It was just innate in me, I think. And so when I said to my mum, I'm not eating meat anymore, she was just like, okay. But it wasn't like, oh, I'm going vegetarian, because she wouldn't have known what vegetarian was. I think it was after doing it that I learned about vegetarianism, kind of thing. So, but no, to answer that question, Deb, no vegans in the family.
Okay, so let's see if we can kind of get our head around this little remit of ours movement-wise now then, because, I mean, obviously, in the recent years, anti-vivisection has almost, you know, it's never stopped, I suppose, but it felt as though it stopped until Camp Beagle or something, right? I mean, like, you know, whoever kind of talked about it. And maybe even sabbing seemed to have stopped, maybe, and now that's back again. But veganism grew to become what we call the moral baseline. Okay, but exactly when is a real mystery to me, because, I mean, like, if I was asked, you know, who was instrumental in bringing about the moral baseline of veganism, I would be forced to say Gary Francione. He's a big player in it. But if you look at his books, for example, the early ones, so you got 95 and 96, no mention of veganism. But then when you get to 2000, Introduction to Animal Rights, no mention of veganism, right? So you're not really getting this until Francione was kind of like bullied into having a website, you know, but by somebody who used to work for Apple. And they said, look, you've got to get on the internet, right? And so he did that. And I think that was 2006, 2007. And then he really starts to push for veganism to be the main thing. Prior to that was meetings that he was involved in where he was suggesting to people like Peter and people who were running the corporations the American corporation at the time, that a lot more effort, if not the only thing, should be put into veganism, and that was flatly rejected, right? And then you've got the 1992 thing, but see, it's all very complicated. But to actually put your finger on when all this happened, it's difficult to know.
Maybe it wasn't as simple as there was a moment. Maybe it was just messy and just started to grow a little bit by bit, and then have like a ripple effect, and then snowballed and all of that. Maybe it was a bit more like that. But I wasn't aware really of vegan campaigning until definitely not till 2000s, and maybe not even early 2000s. More, I would say, not until like even maybe 2010 or later than that. I don't know. And maybe that just wasn't in my awareness because of what I was doing, but I can't really remember knowing about it before that. But I know Jake was saying that in the United States, he was aware of it like in the early 90s, but I definitely wasn't aware of it then.
No, okay. So let's see if we can get an angle on this by thinking about the anti-vivisection organizations or groups. So when the idea of the Federation of Local Animal Rights Groups came about, there was 5 anti-vivisection groups in Britain at the time. So Animal Aid was called one, but then there's the BYV, British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection, the NAVS, National Anti-Vivisection Society, then there was the Scottish Anti-Vivisection Society, and then there was something called the Society of the Prevention of Vivisection. That was also Scotland. So there was 5. Now, if I think of a group like Animal Aid, who's become part now of the vegan movement, it must have been the time when their previous focus on vivisection must have just kind of faded away for some reason. The NAVs, did they do the same? I do know that one thing that could have affected it was that they were concerned about the single issueness of vivisection, so they started to branch out into other things like animals defenders and stuff like this. That was the NAVs and stuff. Yeah. But again, it's still quite interesting to see how this kind of evolution has happened. It's almost like anti-vivisection kind of fizzled out. The BYV was central to what I remember when I came into the movement, because it was just being radicalized and all that. And lots of us were involved. And then it moderated and changed its claims making from, the opposition to all animal experiments to the opposite to animal experiments. So they took the all out. And then they changed the name to Cruelty Free International. And it's still a mystery to how this process happened, in the sense that we got an entire movement that stopped doing one thing and started doing something else. Yeah. No, it is. I completely agree. It is difficult to see where the shift happened or why or how, but I wonder if it was to do with, or maybe part of this anyway, is to do with during the kind of 70s, 80s, 90s, when anti-vivisection was quite prevalent within the modern animal rights movement. It was the focus. There was direct action, and then as a result of some of that direct action, there was a backlash. Obviously, activists were being given harsh sentences. There was changes legally. There was more security being created in the places that were being targeted. There were injunctions where activists weren't allowed to even go within a certain area to do activism, injunctions around certain universities or laboratories and that kind of thing.
And then obviously with the harsh sentences and the changes in some of the laws where you could be given a sentence for something much more minor than you would have before and things like that. And I just wonder whether the landscape changed as well, whether that's part of it. Maybe it's not the only part, but maybe it's part of that jigsaw puzzle, one of the pieces or a few of the pieces of that change of landscape. Of there was a big surge of activism and direct action, and then a backlash against that, and then things kind of settled, or and then something kind of came out of that, which would have been more maybe the vegan outlet, or
I mean that seems really plausible to me. At the same time, for example, there was a sea change in people's attitude to direct action. When the homes dried up, and it turned much more to economic sabotage, damage. There was a sea change even within the movement, right? Mm-hmm. But that wouldn't have necessarily pushed them into veganism. It just means that they would carry on with their kind of anti-vivisection. And then in terms of direct action, I think that some of the direct action that took place was understood as being anti-vivisection direct action. But I don't ever remember any vegan direct action. In other words, the ALF have done this for veganism. That was never said, I don't think. Right? No. Yeah. So it's like we've got all these pieces, but they're not fitting together to tell a story, right?
And maybe so there was a rise of the more kind of the organized groups as well, Viva, Animal Aid, obviously PETA in United States, and maybe with the rise of the more corporatized groups, maybe there was a sea change there as well. So maybe it's another part of that puzzle is that growth of the organized groups as opposed to the grassroots activism, which is more part of the anti-vivisection direction.
For two of the groups that you just mentioned, it doesn't quite fit because Animal Aid were doing a lot of anti-vivisection and then they weren't, and then PETA presumably the same. So there's a zeitgeist shift somewhere in the movement, which is really kind of interesting to try and trace it. Because I mean, like, we're talking about the history of our movement, and yet this part of it is completely out of focus to me. It's difficult to put your finger on anything to say, well, this is the reason. I mean, like, if we look at the movement now, it doesn't look anything like the movement that we joined, right? But to actually trace the changes.
It's like that when you look in the mirror, though, isn't it? Or you look back at a photograph of you when you were 10 years younger and look in the mirror every day. You don't notice the changes, but you look back 10 years at a picture and you go,
speak for yourself,
and then you go, well, how did that happen? I didn't notice that. And maybe it's a bit like that. It's like the changes are happening so gradually and just, like that ripple effect that you don't really notice it. It's not like a massive change that you suddenly see, but you just look back and see, wow, that's really shifted and evolved in a way that I didn't see coming. Or maybe it's something to do with that as well.
Yes, I wonder. There's been some chat. I'm not quite sure about this one. Even if outreach was prevalent in the 1990s, I'm not sure where it gets us. It took 400 years to end the gladiator Colosseum, and that involved atrocities towards our own species. Okay. I struggle to agree with the case against vegan outreach. I don't know how we're going to get where we want to. Yeah. But Jeremy, we're kind of just trying to trace the change here. We're not trying to put one against the other or anything like that. I don't think if I'm reading you right, and I probably not after 6 hours, but. Deb says, do you think the rise of factory farming and the billions of other animals used in that industry and its more visible consequent help cause the shift of focus?
Well, that's interesting, actually, Deb, and thank you for that comment, because I've heard activists talk about that when because as you know, I've had a lot of conversations with Mel Broughton, who was very prevalent in anti-vivisection and still is, and still advocates for much more of that kind of direct action and pressure campaigns and all that stuff, rather than vegan outreach. Again, I'm not pitting one against the other because I don't think there's a magic bullet in the movement at all. But at a time when anti-vivisection was definitely neglected, I think it's obviously had a bit more of a surge in the last few years, and especially with Camp Beagle. But before that, when I was speaking to Mel, and I've done a few podcasts with him about this as well on Thrive Vegan World, if anyone wants to check some of those out, there's more about this. But I have heard activists say that in terms of number, so-called animal agriculture has billions, trillions of other animals who are being, bred and used and murdered each year, compared to a much smaller number of other animals who are being used in science for vivisection. So I have heard that said, in that if we could conquer animal agriculture first, that would be a massive win, of course. But it does raise that question in terms of animal rights, because in a way, does this speak more to utilitarianism in terms of we're calculating like the number of other animals suffering, or the amount of suffering, and that kind of thing? And then also you could compare, suffering, if you wanted to go down that road, like some of the atrocities that are happening in research and all that stuff are absolutely horrendous. But in terms of animal rights, we are concerned with the rights of each individual. So when we talk about numbers, it does put us, I think, into murky waters. But to Deb's point, that is an interesting question, because that might very well be on some activists' mind when they're doing outreach, and I have heard them say that as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because this is fascinating for me, because I've almost it's like sand through your fingers for me. This issue, it's got really quite interesting. You mentioned Mel Broughton. What do you think he would say to the question that we're trying to grapple with?
I know he wasn't around for some of the time.
well, that could be part of the story, couldn't it?
Exactly. And that's what I mean about the whole landscape changing. That a lot of the activists who are really prevalent and pushing and organising campaigns and involved in direct action weren't around, and also because some of these high profile activists weren't around, there was also that, and all the Sha people. Yeah.
So maybe people think, this anti-vivisection stuff is a bit dangerous. It wouldn't have changed
Absolutely.
the national group, though, would it? Though, wouldn't change those.
Well, there's also the fact that the national groups have to fund their organisations as well, and maybe it's much harder to. Maybe they started to see that it was easier to get funding against so-called cruelty in different industries. I don't know. It'd be interesting to speak to someone who was at Animal Aid at that time, around the change, just to get their view on that. But I wonder if there's
if only there was a forum
politics were.
To talk to us on something like if only there was an animal rights show that they could come on to and speak to us.
That'd be a good idea, wouldn't it?
It would, yeah. Now, one thought that occurred to me when I was thinking about this idea is that, and this goes to veganism versus pressure campaigning and everything, and the fact that the people in the pressure campaigns kind of don't have to be vegan. Okay, but obviously vegan advocacy is based on everyone being vegan. So I'm wondering whether, see if I can articulate this, that the kind of that as veganism did start to become more prevalent, there was internal problems within anti-vivisection when suddenly people did start asking, how long have you been vegan? And the questions that we never asked each other. If that started to be asked within anti-vivisection groups, maybe a lot of the flesh consumers left, and so therefore anti-vivisection kind of weakened. And then on the other side of it, a lot of vegans are not opposed to all vivisection, right? So I wonder if those two little points have got something to do with our story, because it's obviously been quite ironic that the rise of Camp Beagle happened at the same time as everyone was talking about vaccines and stuff. Yeah, but and so that then seemed to create a divide then between the people who saw themselves as vegan and then the people who saw themselves as animal rights, pressure campaign, that type of thing. And I do remember Mel would say that kind of thing, that the animal rights and veganism are not the same, because look at all the vegans who are not opposed to vivisection. So that would be a big problem for him, wouldn't it?
Yes, definitely. Mel would definitely is not a fan so much of vegan outreach, in that he sees it that vegan outreach is asking people to change their lifestyle, and he says it doesn't really, it's not, for him, it's not animal rights. He definitely sees them as separate things, and he doesn't really even talk about veganism in his own activism. He would call himself an animal rights activist. Although he lives vegan, he doesn't necessarily go about calling for veganism. So he feels that it's a separate thing. And I've had conversations about that with Mel as well. But also in terms of the vegan and activist sort of issue that you just mentioned with Camp Beagle, that has actually happened. So at Camp Beagle, there have been times where people who are not vegan, who have got involved in the campaign, have been welcomed by some, but not welcomed by others. And so because they weren't vegan, and so vegans were very unwelcoming in terms of like, how can you be here? You're not a vegan, you're a hypocrite, that kind of messaging. Whereas others are saying, no, we need to welcome these people in because they're campaigning on the same side as us. And then within that campaigning, we can influence them, we can outreach them, we can explain how we live. So I think there are different attitudes even within that. But I think that's always been true in a way of, like, even looking back into the history of anti-vivisection, the anti-vivisection movement definitely predates veganism and the modern animal rights movement by a long stretch, doesn't it? Going back into the 19th century. And most of
that could be a crucial difference that you just identified there, because going back to when we started, nobody had a conversation about veganism, and so it's not as though there was a group of vegans within the anti-vivisection movement who saw their job as, even if you were to welcome non-vegans, is to do something about the non-vegans. That wasn't even that wasn't addressed. Whereas now, because of this centrality of veganism, it would be, because then you've got a slightly different argument about, do we invite the non-vegans in? Whereas back in the day, you just here's some more anti-vivisectionists. The vegan thing wasn't part of the conversation, I don't think. So I think that might be a difference. And people have been suggesting that maybe social media have changed things in the sense that the one point that might be relevant here is the kind of gatekeeping that used to go on in the movement before social media. And obviously social media have given any Tom, Dick and Roger can go on the internet now and put a show together and all that kind of stuff, right? But when it was a question of you writing your letter to the editor of a magazine that came out 4 times a year, right? There was a lot more control over the discourse within the movement back then. So that might be part of it. And then you've got this other section, not only just social media, but then social media activists. So now we're really into the second decade of the 21st century at this stage, and to flip it around, some of the influences of kind of argued that veganism didn't really exist until then. That it just didn't register. Now, obviously, what it means ultimately is that they didn't know about veganism, and so they assumed it didn't exist, whereas of course it did. And I think
I'm just remembering the whole Joy Carbstrong thing when he said the movement began in 2018 or something. I'm just giggling about that. Sorry.
Yeah. So, did he say that recently or something?
No, do you remember that was ages ago when I think he was being interviewed or something, and something about when this movement started around 2018. I think it was something like that. I know we definitely had a little joke about it on the Animal Rights Show, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Not that we would do anything like that, but.
Well, about a month ago, maybe even less now, somebody did say on Instagram that AV started the movement. Anonymous of the Voice.
Okay.
So
interesting.
That's 2016.
Yeah. And then, it might have been 16. Yeah.
Yeah, and then the ones that go way back, they go back to the 1990s and Gary Yourofsky, right? So yeah, and so
I think it seems to be. It depends on where people enter the movement as well, and as Natasha brought up about social media, and as you just said as well, I think that also adds to the picture in that when any Tom, Dick, Roger, etc. could start posting, and then you get these so-called influencers putting out. Often it's the same kind of content, isn't it? It's stopping people in the street, having a conversation about veganism, the I gotcha moment, and showing them to be a hypocrite and all of that. And I think that became a very popular version of activism. And then that, because of the nature of social media, that's just like proliferated, and that has become much more well known. And then if people are coming into the movement, and especially because that's how people can access information now, that's where people are getting their information, and that's where they're getting their influences, and that's how they're coming into the movement. So, and there's very little about vivisection on social media. It's all veganism, it's all vegan outreach, and it's all conversations on the street and that kind of thing. So other things maybe haven't been spoken about, which goes back to something else which you said, was a lot of vegans aren't really aware of being anti-vivisection, because there are certain, like I know going back to when I first became an activist, you were kind of boycotting and campaigning to boycott people like Procter & Gamble, Unilever, those kind of places. You wouldn't touch their products with a barge pole. You would definitely not buy any of the products, whereas now you get a vegan version of something and it's held up as in high esteem. Oh, look what this company have brought out. They brought out a vegan version, and it might be a product made by
Unilever, Procter & Gamble, and then McDonald's, Burger King, and all the modern vegans, are in there, kind of they're their new customers, whereas, like you say, we wouldn't have touched them. Actually, Ronnie has joined us, so how about we bring Ronnie on and put some of the ideas that we've talked about through to him, and see how he kind of copes with the dilemma. We've been trying to, well, I've been struggling a lot, to be honest, to kind of pinpoint when and why the movement stopped mainly being an anti-vivisection movement and started becoming mainly a vegan movement.
Hi, Ronnie, by the way.
Hi, happy Vegan Day to you both.
Happy Vegan Day.
Yeah, and to all our listeners, of course, and
some viewers.
I think to answer the question, I think maybe the kind of the mid 90s was when we started getting the vegan fairs, and I think that was the kind of the beginnings of the increase in vegan outreach, stroke vegan education from that time, and up until then it kind of had been there was a lot of focus on anti-vivisection. Not just that. I mean, there was the fur trade as well. There was anti-hunting. they're all these what might be called single issues rather than veganism, and vegan outreach really only started in any kind of recognizable way, I suppose we might say, in the mid 90s.
Yeah,
So
I hear you, Ronnie, but going back to, I mean, what me and Wendy been saying is that, because I mean, we didn't talk about the vegan fairs. I never thought about that, but surely the movement was dominated by anti-vivisectionism when the vegan fairs started.
Yeah, yes, I think it was, but I think gradually the idea of advocating for veganism kind of took hold, and as that idea increased, the kind of the emphasis on anti-vivisection became less. But there's also another factor to be taken into consideration, and that's the actions of the state. We had sort of, very high profile campaigns against vivisection. I mean, the ALF to really quite a large extent was focused on combating the vivisection industry. It was mainly that and the fur trade, the main focus of ALF actions. So that made anti-vivisection high profile, and then you had campaigns like the campaign against Hillgrove Farm, the cat breeders and the bred cats for laboratories, and there was the New Church Guinea Pigs New Church campaign. That was another breeder for laboratories. And then the campaign against Huntingdon Life Sciences as well. These are all high-profile campaigns against vivisection. But eventually, that was, I mean, the kind of all those campaigns in the end. I mean, the Hillgrove campaign was a success in that farm closed down, and the cats were, I think, taken away and rehomed by the RSPCA. But in terms of the campaign against Huntingdon Life Science, of course, that was eventually crushed by the state. The ALF and ALF actions became very much depleted because of the actions of the state as well. So I think that was the reason why the anti-vivisection movement kind of went into decline, because these high-profile campaigns were brought to an end.
Yeah, we talked about that, didn't we, Wendy? Yeah. But it still doesn't. It still doesn't really. That doesn't explain the decline, if you like, or the kind of whatever's happened to the NAVs and the BUAV and animal aid vivisection. I mean, like you know a lot about animal aid. So when did
animal aid? I mean, the anti-vivisection is only one. I mean, animal aid have got a lot of strands to their bow, so to speak, in that they campaign on various like areas of the oppression of other animals.
Yeah, but Ronnie, you know as well as I do, vivisection would be front page of their mag all the time.
I mean, they started off how they initially built their membership was on a platform of anti-vivisection and anti-factory farming, and that was how they built up their membership in the early days, through giving out leaflets on those issues, and that's how the
anti-factory grew. Farming.
Yes.
What do you think of this, Wendy? Because anti-factory farming is not necessarily vegan, is it?
No, definitely not. It's but can I just add one thing as well with that? Do you both think that possibly, in terms of especially like the national groups and animal aid, do you think maybe because of like the high profile campaigns, also the media coverage and ALF, all of that, that kind of coverage in the media maybe wasn't tolerated as much by the public anymore, because activists were now being shown to be so-called terrorists, and it kind of maybe had a bad taste, left the public with a bad taste in their mouth, and maybe that was also part of that landscape where the national organisations didn't want to touch that, especially fundraising. They've got to pay for their organisation.
It doesn't make the anti-vivisection groups, the corporations, want to change to vegan ones. Why? Even if suddenly direct action becomes out of fashion, which it did, it doesn't mean that they stop being anti-vivisection, does it? That's the bit I don't understand.
Maybe it fizzled. Maybe it wasn't a sudden thing. Maybe it fizzled because of all these things that we're talking about. Maybe it just fizzled over time. And if they were already starting to get involved in the vegan outreach and campaigning, then they just focused more on that because vivisection was falling out of favour much more with the public as well.
Well, I mean, the anti-vivisection organisations have always been anti-vivisection, and they've always focused on that, and they've never included veganism in their campaigns. The NAVs haven't. Neither of the BVV. Of course, the BVV changed its name. They're now known as Cruelty Free International.
And I'm definitely not vegan, because I've had conversations, arguments with them as well about non-vegan ingredients in their products.
They kind of sort of distanced themselves from grassroots campaigning, and concentrated more on putting pressure on politicians and stuff like that. They kind of, in a sense, went back to what they were before, because of course these organisations became radicalised in the probably sort of late 70s, early 80s, around about that period, where they were kind of sort of taken over by kind of radical vegans, and they weren't turned into organisation campaigning for vegan, but they became more grassroots. They organised the yearly World Day for Animals in Laboratories marches, and at one time those marches were attracting 10 to 20,000 people, because both BWAV and the NAVs were encouraging their members to go on those marches, and so that they were very involved in kind of sort of protest activity. And
but that just creates more questions, because I mean, I did something, and I saw NAVs were claiming that one of their marches they had 32,000 people, right? And now that the World Day now, it's a couple of hundred, isn't it? Or
yeah, I think there's a kind of general sort of explanation for that as well. That's kind of I mean, there's been a general sort of reduction in numbers for protests in relation to animals across the board. I mean, it's not really just to do with anti-vivisection. I think once those big organisations, they pulled out of organising World Day, and once they pulled out of organising World Day, it was left to the grassroots, grassroots to do it. And I think it was taken on each year by different animal rights groups, and there was like a core of people that kind of were involved in organising it each year, and they did it they tried to do it in collaboration with the local animal rights group that represented the city where the march was going to be held. And I remember I used to go to some of the planning meetings they had for the various marches, but they never attracted the numbers. And I think it's because the national organisations were mailing out to their members, encouraging their members to go on these marches. And of course, they really no longer did that once they were no longer organising those marches themselves. For some reason, they no longer wanted to become involved in that. I don't quite know the reason for that, but that affected the numbers. And
Wendy, we're coming to the end of our time, but I'm not sure we've answered our question. Do you?
I don't think we've got a definitive answer, but I think we have got a few little pieces of the puzzle that might fit together, and maybe, yeah. Because also, like, even in terms of, you mentioned Ronnie mentioned Hillgrove cats and the guinea pig farms and things, and actually even in terms of that kind of selective breeding, manipulated breeding that was going on externally, that then became more internal for laboratories, didn't it? So even things like that, you don't have the same targets that you used to have even in the movement. So even if and I think another point to that as well is the national organizations, when they're campaigning for veganism, they can ask their members to do something. But I think with anti-vivisection campaigns, sometimes you feel a bit stuck in like, well, what do we get people to do? Because at the end of the day, you can ask someone to start living vegan, to stop consuming other animals, to start, changing what they wear, etc. But with anti-vivisection, it seems like there's less of a particular thing you can ask people to do, or maybe that's part of it as well. And even in terms of targets, you didn't have the same targets anymore. You didn't have the accessibility to all these breeding facilities and laboratories and things like that. So what were activists to do, and what could members of the public do in terms of membership of these national organizations? It's probably perhaps a bit more complex. I think there are so many elements. And also in the 70s and 80s in the UK, and probably in America as well, or North America, I think it was a much more politically radical time generally. If you look around at even human issues, people were much more politically minded and radical. And, you know, you've got the poll tax marches, and you've got all the miners' strikes and things like this going on in terms of the bigger picture. Whereas I think coming into the 2000s, blah, 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 things seem a lot more moderate generally, and people seem a lot more moderate. So I think there are changing times in the background as well. And of course, we don't live in a vacuum. We're a product of our time, as we know. So
no, we don't live in a Dyson. It's
or a Henry.
A Henry Hoover. Although sometimes I feel like I do. I don't know about anyone else.
We had a cat once that loved being vacuumed. Cat called Blackie. And when I was vacuuming the carpet, he'd come and throw himself in front of the vacuum cleaner to be vacuumed. And we even had a song.
Yeah, Momo was like that. Yeah, we had a deaf cat called Momo, and she loved to be vacuumed. Yeah,
crazy.
And if you saw Dylan, if I put the vacuum cleaner on, you see Dylan, big, huge, powerful, muscular dog. He's terrifying.
Jeremy.
He looks at me and he goes, "What are you doing?" Oh, Jeremy. That was nice one, Jeremy.
That's great. I like that.
Right. Well, I suppose we're done, really, but I don't feel as though we've done much. I don't mean that as a real negative thing. I think this is too complicated to, because it's like I was saying before, Ronnie, that this is like part of the history of our movement, which to me at least is really out of focus. You know, you can't go, oh well, that happened and this happened, you know, and all, it seemed to be just too.
I think, do you think maybe you're looking for a perfectly rounded answer in a little package with a little bow on top, Laura? Did you think that history, because history, when we look at history in books, that's not how it really happened, is it? Do you know what I mean? That's just a written version from somebody's perspective. At the time, it was messy and complex and hard to pinpoint things. I think we only think that it was nice and neat because of how people frame it in history books and things, but I'm sure it's a lot messier than that.
It's a lot of factors altogether. Sorry, I think that's what it is, and that's why, that's why it's difficult, because it isn't just one. It isn't just one thing. It's a combination of different things.
Yeah, but as Wendy says, most historical things probably are, but we've still got histories of things. So if somebody was to say, okay, let's write a book on this shift,
I nominate you.
It'd be difficult to know.
I think what happened. I think if you look at say the last two big campaigns that we had against vivisection here in the UK, like the Sha Campaign, which is against hunting and life sciences, and the Speak Campaign, which was against a primate research facility being built at Oxford University. And both those campaigns ended up being crushed by the state, with the major figures in those campaigns sentenced to long periods of imprisonment. But those campaigns sucked in a hell of a lot of people. One of the kind of, in a sense, complaints about Sha was that it took people away from other forms of activism. Everyone, because it had such initial success in stopping companies that was supplying Huntington Life Sciences. That's what it was aimed at. It was aimed at cutting off their supply chains. Even the company that supplied toilet paper to HLS stopped doing so. For instance, that was where they were trying to cut off their.
Come on, Jeremy. There's a joke in there somewhere.
Yeah,
toilet paper. Come on.
they were wiped out. Yeah, to do with wiping out, probably. And of course, so everyone was kind of pulled into that, and then when that kind of ended up being crushed, I think there were maybe a lot of people that just stopped doing stuff altogether, because there was this great hope of this big major victory that looked like it was almost there. It was only because even no banks would give banking facilities to hunting and life sciences, and if that had remained the situation, the company would have gone under, because you can't operate without banking facilities. But the government moved in and gave them. It was like something that never happened before. They gave HLS banking facilities with Bank of England in order to save them, because there was no way the government were going to allow these, to these radical animal liberationists to win. You see, and so that's what happened. The government propped them up in various ways, and then brought in measures against the activists.
What you've just said there, Ronnie, is really fascinating, actually, because rather than thinking that the same movement has moved from vivisection to veganism, it's probably that the vivisection movement, kind of because of its kind of losses or kind of repression by the state, it kind of got smashed, and another movement, which something
came along to fill the gap. It was smashed, and of course people would be tremendously disheartened, because this looked like being the biggest victory ever against animal experimentation.
But it's not the same people, though. That's what I'm saying.
It's not the same people, no, and all those people that were kind of, involved in kind of the main figures in those campaigns. Pretty much all of them are kind of disappeared. So, some of them are still around campaigning on other issues. Some are involved in rescue, but a lot of them don't seem to be really campaigning anymore. It wasn't just it was those people were kind of, I wouldn't say crushed as individuals, but like.
Okay. Here's a sociological question, and then we'll finish with. I'm going to put Debbie's question to Wendy, but a sociological question is they talk about social movements going into kind of periods of latency and everything, and so everything calms down, and then it comes back, and so maybe things like Camp Beagle has brought back lots and lots of anti-vivisectionists who were active back then, when you were talking about, New Church and everything, and then it got crushed, and then they just kind of didn't do anything for a while, and then they're back now because their campaign has returned. They never really got involved with the vegan one particularly, or something like that.
I think that's, I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think some of them got involved in other campaigns, some of them got involved in other single issue campaigns. But I think the Camp Beagle sort of phenomenon is like a combination of different things. Yes, there are some kind of old school campaigners that have kind of been awoken from their slumber by Camp Beagle and have kind of thought, great, anti-vivisection's back on the agenda again, and I'll get involved because
So they're woke now, are they? Is that right? They're woke now.
They're woke. Yes, they're woke. They've been woke up. And that's
what you were saying, Wendy. Really, that's a story you were saying, weren't you? That there's the Camp Beagle now is not the same as a kind of old style anti-vivisection thing, because there's a lot more vegans involved and stuff, and so it's created new questions and new divisions and all that. So
and just general divisions, I think, in terms of humans. Just humans and not seeing eye to eye on different things, but definitely slightly different mindset in terms of, I think the majority of people who would have originally been involved in that campaign at Camp Beagle would have been vegans, but then as it became more high profile and it was in the Daily Mirror and Ricky Gervais and Will Young and Peter Egan and these high profile people got more involved as well, it became a wider campaign, and then it attracted more non-vegans and locals as well, because obviously the locals were driving by and seeing what was going on and wanted to get involved once they learned what it was. So then it attracted more non-vegans. So it was almost like activists that had been focusing more on the vegan stuff or anti so-called fur, then kind of got involved in Camp Beagle, but then attracted more non-vegans. So I think it came from a different place.
Sorry, Wendy.
Yeah, we've got.
That's all right.
Ronnie and I-
I'm used to you laughing at me. I can take it. It's fine.
No, it wasn't you. It's what Andy said.
Yeah,
What Andy said.
Andy said that.
Basically, an orgy with banners. Okay.
There's not. I mean, you know, when I've been there, there's not been enough people there. I went there once. There was 2 people. Not really enough people.
How many people do you want for an orgy, Ronnie?
Well, you need more than 2, don't you, for an orgy? I mean, I weren't taking on it, so that was only 2. So
Okay, well,
they were having an orgy before I turned up.
Let's go back to this to finish then. Do you think all social justice movements are losing ground these days? I think that's got something to do with what you said, Wendy, about people not being as political anymore. And certainly I get the impression that they don't see the interconnections, because when I do my time tunnels, over and over again, people are saying, oh, I got involved with that because I was involved in this and I saw the connection between the two and all that kind of stuff. You don't seem to have that kind of rhetoric that much, even going right back to animal welfare and its association with the NSPCC and that kind of stuff. There's always those kind of justice-based movements that even if it ended up being funneled into separate social movements or social movement organizations, they were coming from a similar kind of place. And maybe, did that make any sense to you, Wendy? Help!
I'm thinking I'm going to get the smelling salts out again, Roger. No, I'm just kidding.
Before our show starts, whenever it starts, I've got to go and get a cup of tea. So you'll have to chat.
Don't forget your mug. Don't forget your pug mug.
Yeah.
Well, that's
for a different reason.
I'll put the sign up because I'm down for a pee. So
yeah, that's it. Yeah, put the engaged sign up.
Yeah, engaged sign up. But going back to this, though, how would you answer that one, Wendy?
Deb's question. So no, I think what you were saying at the beginning about not being radical and all of that stuff, I think definitely that plays part of it, and not seeing intersections and maybe also staying separate. Was that part of what you were saying as well? Like staying separate, and obviously as a small movement anyway, and we seem to
and also a big push in the movement. I mean, like it became a saying in our movement: "Stay in your lane." I've never heard that before.
Yeah, stay in your lane, but in a way that kind of then does keep you really small, doesn't it? Staying in your lane, and then also makes you not be aware of other people's oppressions, but also other movements who could be our allies, where we can intersect. I mean, even looking at the anti-vivisection movement, there's a great, and obviously we haven't got time to go into this now, but there's a great crossover with feminism in the anti-vivisection movement, right from its very foundations in the 1800s, and there always has been all along. So there are these intersections along the way in the movement that is really useful to know, and also to take inspiration from other movements, I think, and to have this awareness, but also not to keep ourselves small and maybe be open. I think we have to have a certain amount of gatekeeping in terms of what we will align ourselves with and what our values are. We have to be strongly grounded in our values, but also if we are so rigid that we keep everyone out who isn't like a level 3004 vegan, then we are going to stay really small as well. So
well, there is a lot of vegetarianism in the movement, that's for sure. So it'd be interesting that we could use Debbie's question to be an I'm right show debate almost, couldn't we, with that one?
Thanks, Deb.
Yeah. So I'd like to thank everybody for still being with us, and thank you, Wendy, for putting up with my confusion in the last hour or so.
You've been brilliant, Roger, honestly.
Actually, though, I mean, to make a serious point, it's not tiredness. It's difficult to answer the question that we set ourselves, I think.
Yeah. No, it's difficult to pinpoint. I don't think there is an answer. I think there is multi-stranded answers that maybe contribute. But just before we go,
folks. So
just before we go, Doc, I know you're going to kick me off any minute, but just before we go, would you mind just
yes, sorry,
bringing up my little?
Yes, blimey. I'm so glad you said that. I was just about to press the button. Sorry about that.
You were just about to eject me, weren't you?
No, I wasn't. No, I wasn't going to kick you out. I was just about to. No, I'm really sorry about that. Hang on a minute. Where are we? Here we go. I think. Let's see if I hope I've got the right one. I'm sure I have. I think
it was the very one I sent. I literally sent it.
The last one. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So
it won't matter too much anyway.
Share screen. Right. So yeah, this is a poignant end to the show, really, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. Should I just bring her up then?
Yeah. So I just wanted to dedicate. Oh, it doesn't show the bottom of that on my screen, but maybe it's just on my screen. Just wanted to dedicate my slot here on the Time Tunnel and Roger's live stream to this little lady, Misha, who sadly died last week after 18 years of brightening my day every single day. And she had trouble with her kidneys and a suspected tumour on her kidneys, and sadly took a turn for the worse last week. And we had to make that dreaded decision, which is a show on its own, in terms of when we care for other animals and having to make that decision for someone else of whether their life is still viable and all of that stuff, and trying to weigh that up with the suffering that's involved. So yeah, a whole other chat involved on that. But yeah, I had to make that dreaded decision. So she died peacefully last week. And so I just wanted to dedicate this to her. And she's very sorely missed. She was a special, magical, precious, beautiful angel. And yeah, the world is a sorer place without her.
With amazing green eyes.
Yeah. Beautiful lady.
So what I'll do is, after we end, rather than going to the World Vegan Day screen, I'll just leave this one up for a couple of minutes, Wendy. So as the outro is playing, we can disappear, and that just leaves people to remember Misha for a couple of minutes while I go and have a pee.
Just on your screen, Roger, does it show? Because I've got all little boxes at the bottom of mine, but that might be just because I'm in the shot.
That's because it's not a slide.
Okay.
So that's all my pictures you can see. It's just that.
Right.
Yeah. So it's because of the way we had to do it. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Because at the bottom, people can't see it, but it just gave the dates.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, Wendy, thanks very much for the last hour.
Thank you for having me, Roger. I really appreciate you asking me and really enjoyed that conversation. I always enjoy talking about anti-vivisection. And thank you to everyone in the chat as well, to the viewers, and for brilliant comments and questions, as always. And happy World Vegan Day.
Yes, and goodbye, everyone.